Nurgle, the chaos god of decay, disease, despair, and somehow being the friendliest eldritch horror in the entire setting. Most of the chaos gods are pretty straightforward. Khorne kills you, Slaanesh makes you obsessed, Tzeentch outsmarts you, but Nurgle just wants to give you a big fat hug. But the problem is, that hug will probably give you 69 new diseases before he lets go. Today we're wrapping up my mini-series where I've been breaking down each of the chaos gods and their current strength in the 42nd millennia. With Nurgle being the final god to cover, the next video is the big one, ranking all 4 of the chaos gods from weakest to strongest. But before we get to that, we've got to cover the grandfather himself. We'll discuss who Papa Nurgle is, his abilities, weapons, and feats, and finally, where the Plague Father scales compared to the rest of the 40k universe. Now, as always, let's fall down the gow hole. For the glory of Nurgle, praise the Plague Father.
You smell that? What is that? What? What's that smell? Cologne?
Nope, it's just Nurgle stinking up my kitchen. Let's start from the beginning. Who exactly is Nurgle? Nurgle is the chaos god of decay, disease, despair, and inevitability. Known by many titles such as Grandfather Nurgle, the Plague Father, the Great Corruptor, Lord of Decay, or as your favorite fallen cow likes to call him, the Big Fat Green Chud. At his core, Nurgle represents the truth that all things rot, from civilizations to bodies to even hope. This is seen in the 8th edition Chaos Demons Codex. Nurgle is the Great Corruptor, the master of plague and pestilence, the fountain and architect of rot itself. He is the embodiment of the truth that all things, no matter how solid and permanent they seem, are subject to decay, and even the process of creation is merely the beginning stage of destruction. The bastion of today is tomorrow's ruin. The maiden of the morning is the crone of the night. And the hope of a moment is but the foundation of regret. In addition to this, Nurgle is also deeply tied to the lived experience of mortality. Fear of death, sickness, helplessness, and despair all feed him as well. But so too does the strange resilience that follows acceptance of suffering. This too is seen in that same codex, the 8th edition. The citizens of the Imperium know full well that their lives will one day end, and that many of their number will live with disease or other torments in the meantime. Yet they drive this knowledge deep into the corners of their minds and bury it with ceaseless activity. Nurgle is partially embodied by that knowledge, and the unconscious response to it. He is the hidden fear of disease and decay, the gnawing fact of mortality, and the power of defiance that it generates. This is why his influence doesn't just grow from plague itself. Say for example that little Johnny is laying awake at night, spiraling into existential dread. Having that thought process we all have. What actually happens upon death? That entire spiral empowers Nurgle. And the logic of the warp, that fear, that surrender, that emotional weight all feeds the Plague Father in some small way. Another example could be, say, a factory worker, coughing through another 18-hour shift on a polluted hive world, telling himself this is just how it is. While knowing the sickness eating through his lungs, that quiet acceptance, that normalization of decay is also Nurgle's domain. Even a grim joke like it is what it is, or at least it can't get any worse, becomes a tiny hymn in his name. In that sense, Nurgle is everywhere mortality is acknowledged, but endured. He is not just the god of plague and rot, but the god of living with it, laughing through it, and slowly becoming part of it. Which I have to say is as morbid as it gets. And it goes even more beyond that, because it appears that every disease, plague, and infection in existence is ultimately attributed to his influence and power. Yet, even weirder is the fact that Nurgle is not portrayed purely as a bringer of misery, but as someone who brings joy and happiness, as his gifts come wrapped in a disturbing sense of comfort. as suffering is transformed into acceptance and devotion. Like, for example, most of his worshippers seem to be joyful and very content with their lives, even though their guts are literally falling out of their stomachs. Now, before I move on, I briefly want to revisit a point I've already covered in my Khorne, Slaanesh, and Tzeentch videos, because of course it also applies to the Plague Dad. Are the Chaos Gods actually sentient beings, or just concepts made manifest in the immaterium? And well, just like I've discussed many times, it's a bit of both. As described in the 6th and 8th edition Chaos Demons Codexes, the Chaos Gods were formed from the accumulated emotions, thoughts, desires, and beliefs of all living beings. Over time, these psychic currents within the warp coalesced into self-aware entities, becoming what we now understand as the Ruinous Pantheon. So, in simple terms, they are both thinking beings and living warp concepts. For Nurgle specifically, this means he is not just a god of disease, but he is literally decay, mortality, despair, and the slow acceptance of inevitable death. He can think, plan, and act with intent, but he is also forever bound to that nature. Nurgle can't stop the spread of rot any more than Slaanesh can stop making people do drugs. I'm hoping that the 4th time is the charm. With that out of the way, what does Nurgle even look like? And well, even though technically speaking Nurgle is a warp being, he still is consistently described as taking a physical form when manifesting to mortals. And yeah, if you thought he was some gross green ball of goo, you're about 95% right. This is his description in the 8th edition Codex. Nurgle himself takes the form of a titanic flesh hulk riddled with decay and pestilence. His gigantic carcass is bloated with corruption and exudes an overpowering stench that gnaws at the mind. His skin is greenish, leathery, and neurotic. Its surface abundant with running sores, swelling boils, and rampant infestation. Nurgle's gurgling and pulsating organs are rank with the excrement of decay spilling and spurtering through his ruptured skin to hang like obscene fruit around his girth.
What did he say?
From these organs burst swarms of tiny Nurglings that chew on his rotting intestines and slurp up Nurgle's bountiful, noxious juices. And if you just threw up in your mouth a little bit, let me tell you, you're not alone. So pretty much, in simpler terms, when Nurgle manifests in a perceivable form, he appears as a massive, disease-ridden corpse, swollen with rot and constantly leaking corruption from every surface. Even his own body is teeming with lesser demons and infections that feed off him, while also being extensions of his very being. And his form kinda goes hand in hand with his realm of chaos, the Garden of Nurgle. Much like Slaanesh's Palace of Pleasure or Tzeentch's Crystal Labyrinth, Nurgle's realm is not a static place, but a living extension of his will, formed entirely from warp stuff, and shaped by the emotions, fears, and psychic residue of mortal life. It can expand, contract, and mutate depending on Nurgle's current strength and will within the Great Game, the never-ending war between the Ruinous Pantheon. This is how Nurgle's garden is described in the 9th edition Demons of Chaos Codex. And just like Nurgle's form, it's really gross. The Garden of Nurgle is an ever-changing realm, shifting according to the needs and whims of its master. Many areas exist only temporarily, taking shape to allow him to indulge a particular fancy, or to be granted to an especially accomplished Great Unclean One as a reward. The Garden of Nurgle is a wondrous place filled with vitality, mirth, and experiences beyond mortal comprehension. It is a playground for the minions of the Lord of Decay, a laboratory for his work, and a comforting home for a god that knows his realm is the shape of things to come. So pretty much, the garden is a constantly rewriting ecosystem of death and decay, where rot and growth are indistinguishable from one another. And at the center of all of it lies Nurgle's mansion of rotten timbers and broken walls. An ancient and decrepit building that paradoxically remains eternally unshaken. And within this mansion lies Nurgle himself. And you're probably wondering, what is the green Chud getting up to? Well, the 8th edition gives us a unique look. Within these crumbling walls, Nurgle toils. Beneath mildewed and bowed beams, the Great Corruptor carries out his eternal work at a rusted cauldron, a receptacle vast enough to contain all the oceans of all the worlds. Chuckling and murmuring to himself, Nurgle labors to create contagion and pestilence, the most sublime and unfettered forms of life. With every stir of Nurgle's maggot-ridden ladle, a dozen fresh diseases flourish and are scattered across the stars. From time to time, Nurgle reaches down with a clawed hand to scoop a portion of the ghastly mixture into his cavernous mouth, tasting the fruits of his labor. With each passing day, he comes closer to brewing his perfect disease. A spiritual plague that will spread across the extent of the universe and see all living things gathered onto his rotting embrace. Once again, that is just so gross. Like, the dude is literally drinking out of that cauldron, but I guess it makes sense. He is the plague god after all.
You don't want to be like this. This is disgusting. This is awful in every way. If I could kill it, I would.
This garden is also home to his captive companion, the Eldari goddess Isha, and Nurgle keeps her imprisoned so he can test his fresh creations upon her. He feeds her new plagues to observe their effects, while she secretly attempts to whisper cures back into the mortal realms. It's a disturbing cycle of experimentation, suffering, and stolen hope hidden within the heart of his domain. And like all other Chaos realms, the garden is not stable. When Nurgle's power rises, it swells outwards into other domains of the warp, sparking wars with the other ruinous powers. Even when it recedes, it leaves behind an imprint of decay that lingers like a wound in reality that never fully heals. When it comes to the relationships of the Chaos Gods, Nurgle hates the purple Nurple himself, Tzeentch, over all others, as described in the 9th edition Chaos Demons Codex. Nurgle is the eternal enemy of the Chaos Power Tzeentch, the Lord of Change. Nurgle and Tzeentch draw their energy from opposing beliefs. While the energy of Tzeentch comes from hope and changing fortune, that of Nurgle comes from defiance born of despair and hopelessness. And just like I covered in my Tzeentch video, this rivalry is not just personal, it's conceptual. Tzeentch represents motion, possibility, ambition, and most of all, change. While Nurgle represents stasis, inevitability, acceptance, and the slow inevitability of death. Where Tzeentch pushes reality into new forms, Nurgle resists that motion by dragging everything towards decay. Despite this cosmic rivalry, Nurgle's influence spreads widely across all mortal life, and so Nurgle is worshipped in countless forms across the galaxy, most often by those seeking a relief from suffering. In practice, though, this rarely does result in salvation. Instead, ailments deepen, corruption spreads, and the afflicted slowly come to accept decay as a comforting normality, rather than a curse. Some turn to him through secretive cults that spread plagues and sabotage populations, while larger warbands, especially Chaos Space Marines, carry his blessings openly, becoming walking vectors of rot and contagion. Others mistakenly interpret his gifts as a desire for pure extinction, forming death cults that often clash with more traditional plague worshippers. In all of these cases, though, the outcome is similar. Suffering is reframed, resistance fades away, and Nurgle's philosophy of inevitable decay takes root wherever his followers endure. And from there, his most notable champions emerge, each reflecting a different part of his endless influence over decay, mutation, and disease. Among his greatest servants stands Mortarion, the demon primarch of plague and rot. Alongside him is Typhus the Traveler, the mortal champion of the plague god, and the biggest piece of shit I've seen in my cow life. Yes, he is literally a piece of shit. Go read Barry Dagger and you'll hate him even more, trust me. There's also Kugaf Plaguefather, one of the most infamous Great Unclean Ones, a Rotgus Rainfather who manifests as a living storm of corruption, bringing cycles of endless rot and renewal wherever he appears. Outside of these big fellows, we have Epidemius, who serves as the keeper of plague statistics, recording every infection as it spreads across reality. These are just a few of the greatest servants of Nurgle. So if all this disgusting stuff broken down, it's time to talk about exactly what Nurgle can do when his power is unleashed on the galaxy. Yeah, you guessed it, it's time to go over Papa Nurgle's abilities, weapons, and most of all, his feats. Let's start as always by going over Nurgle's more specific abilities. First off, as we discussed earlier, Nurgle is the very embodiment of disease, decay, and rot. In fact, the 8th edition Chaos Demons Codex makes it very clear just how total his influence is on reality. Every single human being in the galaxy has been touched by Nurgle's foetid hand at some point. Countless trillions are host to his malignant, invisible creations, which corrupt their physical forms and sow despair in their minds. Interplanetary traffic ensures that contagious diseases are carried from world to world by the ignorant and the willful alike. As Nurgle's gifts multiply into full-blown pandemics, his power reaches a peak. Whole systems, even whole sectors, are quarantined as plague runs rife across the stars. Proud civilizations wither away even as the god of decay conjures obscene new life from their remains. Wherever there are plague pits and mass graves, the rotting splendor of Nurgle shines through. What this is describing is how Nurgle's power scales with the amount of infection in the known universe. Meaning the more life interacts, travels, suffers, and decays, the stronger the Chud becomes. And remember, Nurgle is fed by these emotions, thoughts, and beliefs across all time, space, and realities. So for example, in a setting like the current 40k galaxy, defined by endless war, death, decay, and collapse, that means Nurgle's power should be incredibly potent in the current setting. So pretty much no living being is ever truly outside of his reach. And most importantly, Nurgle's influence is not limited to biology, as his plagues extend far beyond flesh into concepts like sanity, perception, technology, and even the soul. Machines rot into demon-corrupted husks, minds degrade into blissful acceptance of suffering, and reality itself can even become infected, where decay behaves like a fundamental law rather than a true physical process. Because Nurgle is decay, pestilence, rot, sickness, plague, and despair, given conscious form, his infections are therefore metaphysical as much as they are physical, giving them the ability to infect reality. This even extends to the other Chaos Gods, as there are instances in the 4th edition Chaos Demons Codex which suggests that Nurgle's plagues can also affect his brothers. Yet just as moons wax and wane, so too does the power balance between the rival gods of chaos. It does not all go Tzeentch's way. His minions dare not mention the disaster at Lam Nagani or the Night of Cataracted Eyes, during which so many of his demons were rendered blind by a supernatural plague that for a time Tzeentch himself contracted this same disease. What this implies is that even warp entities, beings made of psychic energy and concept, can be afflicted by his plagues. Whether this is a literal infection or a symbolic metaphysical corruption, the result is still the same. Nurgle's powers can indeed impose decay upon forces that should theoretically exist outside of it. But I'm not gonna lie, that's kind of about it for Nurgle's more specific abilities. And compared to the other Chaos Gods, it does feel a bit lame. Tzeentch can see all past, present, and most futures, and Khorne is feeling endless violence across all realities. And Nurgle, well, he just kinda spreads syphilis like there's no tomorrow.
Say that again?
At this point, he's more of a cute little green guy. Or, wait, my bad, I forgot the proper technical term. A big old green chud. Anyway, with that in mind, we can move on to Nurgle's more broad chaos powers. And just like his siblings, Nurgle exists and can manipulate higher dimensions beyond conventional reality. He can influence concepts, causality, and the fundamental laws of existence. And more importantly, he can reshape the warp according to his will, as seen in the 4th edition Chaos Demons Codex. The realm of chaos is a place of dreams and nightmares, where cause need not follow effect. Within its bounds, anything is possible. Here, there are no physical laws akin to those that dominate the mortal world. Within its confines, hopes and fears become real, and reality is reborn as fevered hallucination. Gravity, shape, space, and reason all are in flux and utterly mutable to the will of the Chaos Gods. Few mortals are capable of perceiving the realm of chaos in its true splendor, for the living mind recoils from its otherworldly landscapes. Thus, no two visions of the realm of chaos are exactly alike, and are often contradictory. This is one of those statements that sounds like a standard warp description at first, but when you apply it to Nurgle specifically, it becomes a lot more disturbing, trust me. Because this isn't just saying the warp is unstable, it's saying reality inside the Immaterium is fully controllable and mutable by the will of the Chaos Gods. And as Nurgle's will expresses itself through decay, so within the warp, that means entire landscapes can rot into bloated, diseased ecosystems, structures decompose themselves, and even core concepts like time, distance, and logic don't remain stable under his influence, instead slowly degrading into slower, heavier, and more stagnant forms of existence. And that's not the only thing Nurgle can manipulate, as he can also influence the skein, the underlining web of fate, possibility, and becoming that sits beneath reality, as described in the book Path of the Seer. In the skein, there is nothing. There are no names, and there are no beings. This is where the mind originates. There is the mind, but nothing is physical. Forms obtain the mind, and thoughts are created. This is called passing. In the not yet formed, the skein divides and splits, but there is no time passing. This is called being. There is an energy that gives life to all things, allowing form to obtain mind and create thought. Forms that create thought share in this energy. This is called life. Let slip being and become passing. Let slip passing and become mind. Become mind and be one with the skein. Now this quote probably made you more confused than I intended it to do. But essentially, the skein is the pre-reality structure of existence, where possibility, identity, and outcome exist as interconnected layers before they fully manifest in real space. It is not a single fixed timeline, but a shifting framework of potential futures. A good way to imagine it is that the Chaos Gods have metaphorical strings attached to the skein. They can pull, strain, twist, and manipulate the threads of possibility in order to nudge reality towards outcomes that benefit them. But they can't simply rewrite fate without resistance. Every movement is contested by the complexity of the skein, as well as by rival Chaos Gods, demons, psychic beings, and other warp entities all fighting over the same web of fate. For Nurgle specifically, the way he influences the skein is through inevitability and decay. Instead of forcing change or amplifying desire, like Tzeentch or Slaanesh, he strengthens the future where endurance fails, where resistance collapses, and where all paths slowly degrade into the same endpoint. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle of decay. The more exhaustion and suffering exist, the more likely futures become where exhaustion and suffering dominate everything else. Now, as a Chaos God, even with all of these absurd powers and reality warping abilities, Nurgle still can't exactly just stroll into the material universe, as the sheer scale of his existence is simply too vast and too large for real space to properly contain. So instead, Nurgle breaks off a fragment of his essence, creating a smaller being that can enter the physical world to carry out his will, spread disease, and rot reality in his name. This is how the process is described in the 8th edition. The Chaos Gods are not alone in warp space. They have created servants from their own essences, the creatures mortals call demons. Demons are beings of a somewhat different nature to their masters, and are the most numerous of the warp's inhabitants. A demon is born when a Chaos God expends a portion of its power to create a separate being. This power binds a collection of senses, thoughts, and purposes together, creating a personality and consciousness that can move within the warp. The Chaos God can reclaim the independence it has given to its minions at any time. This ensures their continuing loyalty and means, although some wayward demons may not act entirely in accordance with their master's commands, even the greatest of them would not dare outright defiance. So pretty much, Nurgle can create variations of himself. By splitting off fragments of his own essence, he can create demons with distinct forms, purposes, and personalities that act as extensions of his will in the material realm. These demons manifest as lesser entities like Nurglings, more organized plague bearers, more specialized heralds, and the terrifying greater demons, the Great Unclean Ones, each varying massively in size, durability, and power, depending on how much of Nurgle's essence was used in their creation. And next, we arrive with his weapon, or I guess, the non-existing one. Since, just like Slaanesh and Tzeentch, Nurgle doesn't really wield a traditional weapon, and to be fair, he doesn't really need one either. As the Chaos God of disease, decay, and rot, killing enemies immediately would be against what he really is. His weapon is time, corrupted, and slowed, turned into a process of eventual death. Where other gods strike to kill, Nurgle infects, and that infection does the work for him. So yeah, Nurgle doesn't really need a fancy sword or axe, since it can give you virtually any disease in existence and watch you slowly succumb to it. Now let's chat about Nurgle's feats across Warhammer 40k. And first off, just like the other Chaos Gods, Nurgle is one of the primary contenders in the Great Game. The endless war fought between the Chaos powers for supremacy over the Warp. This conflict has raged since the dawn of time, with the gods constantly battling for power across the Warp, while seeking to expand their influence in the material realm, as seen in the 8th edition Chaos Demons Codex. With the ebb and flow of energy within the Warp, the power of a Chaos God expands and contracts, and his realm will shift accordingly. For long periods, one god may dominate the others, fed by its own success and leeching its foe's energy for its own growth. Eventually, the other gods will ally against the dominant force, and through combined efforts, reduce him in power until another of their number rises to prominence. This pattern is played out again and again through eternity. It seems unlikely that any Chaos God could ever truly be victorious, and it is unthinkable what might happen should such an event ever occur, but it certainly is not for the lack of trying. That same codex goes on to describe that these conflicts can shake the Warp, with the repercussions spilling into real space through warp storms and demonic invasions. This shows that the Chaos Gods really are kinda just built different, as their fights have an after effect of shaking the entire Warp to its core and damaging the barrier between real space and the immaterium. This is also a feat for Nurgle as well, as simply being a main contender in the Great Game means that Nurgle possesses enough strength and power to contend with Khorne, Tzeentch, and Slaanesh without being overwhelmed or destroyed outright. Now, of course, I'm not going to spoil exactly where Nurgle currently ranks within the Ruinous Powers. That's for the conclusion of this series, which is coming next. But it is important to remember that the strength of the Chaos Gods fluctuates depending on what is happening in real space. For example, periods of rampant warfare empower Khorne, civilizations collapsing into excess strengthen Slaanesh, and eras of ambition, change, and upheaval feed Tzeentch. And Nurgle, well, he thrives whenever the galaxy falls into despair and rot. And in many ways, the current era of 40k is almost tailor-made for him. The Imperium is stagnating, entire sectors are collapsing, and countless billions live short, miserable lives under the constant threat of starvation, invasion, mutation, or disease. It is exactly the kind of environment that allows Nurgle's influence to spread like cancer through both reality and the Warp. Now on the topic of the Great Game, there have been countless wars, invasions, betrayals, and battles for dominance between the Ruinous Gods. Unfortunately though, for me and you guys, most of these conflicts are not recorded, and there are likely thousands of victories and defeats we simply have never heard about. Still, the sources we do have paint a pretty insane picture of Nurgle's influence and power across the wider 40k setting. First off, in the 8th edition Chaos Demons Codex, it is noted that if the Chaos Gods had worked together following the formation of the Great Rift and the Imperium being split in two, they may have been able to consume real space. Had the Chaos Gods worked in unison in the wake of that terrible event, it is doubtless that real space would have been utterly consumed by the sprawling madness of the Warp. Yet true to their nature, the Dark Brothers saw the Anarchy as an opportunity to fulfill their own agendas, to kill, to change, to pollute, to bathe in excess. So divided, they are unable to overcome the fierce resistance of the galaxy's inhabitants. So right here, we have confirmation that the ruinous pantheon has enough power to overwhelm reality, destroying it utterly, which I kind of assume you already knew, since I've already repeated it 3 times in my past 3 Chaos God videos. In terms of more specific feats, Nurgle also fought Prime Tzeentch when he ruled over all creation and the warp, alongside Khorne and Slaanesh. And even though they did emerge victorious, it took the efforts of all 3 of them to bring the purple Nurgle down. And just the fact that Nurgle was able to challenge and eventually overthrow this version of Tzeentch is a pretty damn impressive feat. Next, after the fall of the Eldari and the birth of Slaanesh, we see Nurgle involved in another major war within the Great Game, as he sought to overthrow an ascendant Khorne alongside Slaanesh and Tzeentch. Glutted upon the souls of the Eldari, the Dark Prince expands his domain. Such a bold move is met with great opposition, and the Chaos Gods turn their attention fully to the Great Game. Meanwhile, Tzeentch allies with Nurgle and Slaanesh to gain ascendancy over Khorne, yet it is short-lived. The Blood God's immense rage at being usurped leads him to reclaim his lost territory and more besides. So from this excerpt from the 8th edition, it appears their alliance actually worked. Together, the 3 Chaos Gods, Tzeentch, Nurgle, and Slaanesh, managed to gain the upper hand against Khorne and drive back his forces. But the important thing to remember, however, is that it took the combined effort of 3 Chaos Gods to accomplish this, which says more about how powerful Khorne was during this period, rather than it suggesting that Nurgle is weak. But hold on, we get even more context on this fight later in this codex, specifically from the Skulllands. And in this excerpt, we find out that Nurgle did indeed play a central role in their campaign, committing vast portions of his forces to assault the Brass Citadel alongside Slaanesh, while Tzeentch manipulated events from behind the scenes, casting illusions to pull Khorne's armies away from his realm. And they even managed to push Khorne's armies all the way back to the walls of the Brass Citadel. Then, in the least suspicious event in Warhammer 40k history, a stray spark of Tzeentchian warp flame somehow ignited Nurgle's carefully cultivated garden that had spread across Khorne's domain. The resulting inferno devastated the allied armies, shattered the invasion, and handed Khorne the opportunity he needed to reclaim his lost territory. Still, for Nurgle, even though his garden got burnt down, which apparently tends to happen to him a lot across canon, this is still a pretty impressive feat. Alongside his allies, he even came within striking distance of overthrowing the dominant Chaos God of that era, and nearly captured the heart of Khorne's realm.
Fire! Fire! Fire!
But alas, that damn stray spark really set him back. In the modern setting of 40k, Nurgle and his demonic legions have also taken part in the Plague Wars, where Mortarion, the Death Guard, and the forces of Nurgle launched a massive invasion of the 500 worlds of Ultramar. Issuing forth from the Scourge Stars, Nurgle's Plague Legions begin a lengthy campaign to corrupt Ultramar. Although they achieve many triumphs, final victory is thwarted by Rabute Guilliman's masterful counterattacks. The ensuing stalemate is only broken where Nurgle recalls much of his strength, ordering his most powerful greater demons and their legions to help defend the Scourge Stars. So as we can see here, ultimately Nurgle is forced to retreat from Ultramar in order to defend the Scourge Stars from the growing threats posed by the other Chaos Gods, Tzeentch and Khorne, which sets the stage for the War in the Rift, which, trust me, we're gonna cover in a moment. Hold on to your beds, guys. We've got to cover Nurgle getting his ass burned first. However, the Plague Wars are extremely important when discussing Nurgle's power in the current setting, because despite all of his strength and gooiness, the campaign ultimately ends in failure. The invasion of Ultramar is repelled, Mortarion is defeated, and worst of all for the Plague God, the Emperor himself intervenes through Rabute Guilliman, and delivers a direct blow against Nurgle within his own realm, as seen in the book Godblight. Guilliman looked over the Garden of Nurgle. He was between two worlds. The warp was a shifting thing, never constant. The garden was a collection of ideas. It had no true form, and through it, he could see a million other worlds that underpined it. The dreams of souls, living and dead, and past that, as if glimpsed through banks of glittering sea mist that evaporated before the morning sun, the battlefield of Ajax. He gripped the sword of the Emperor, two-handed, and raised it high. Rising waves of fire ripped into the garden. From the great manse, a cry of rage sounded, as a wall of flame hotter than a million suns devoured everything in its path, finally breaking and receding within yards of the black walls of Nurgle's house. Its infinite hall shook, mossy tiles fell from the roof, sodden timber steamed. And if I'm being quite honest, fellas, this is one of the most impressive anti-chaos feats in the entire 40k setting. Not only did Nurgle lose the Plague Wars, but the Emperor, acting through Guilliman, was able to burn a massive section of the Garden of Nurgle, as the flames reached all the way to the black walls of Nurgle's house, shaking his realm in the process. And once again, I would like to remind everyone that this has happened multiple times to Nurgle's garden. Kaldor Drago did it, a random Herald of Tzeentch did it, and now the Emperor did it. 2 times I can understand, but a 3rd time? Come on, Nurgle, you need to start firing some people and taking some ownership over your domain. But the real awkward part about this feat is that Grandfather Nurgle, the fat Chud, didn't stop it. And he was in his own domain, guys. He was in his own realm, and he let Guilliman, being possessed by the Emperor, light his entire garden on fire. Man, what a rough couple of years it's been for the Green Chud. But that is not it, people. No, it is not. Like I talked about earlier, Nurgle also fought in the War in the Rift, which erupted shortly after the Plague Wars ended. This conflict saw all 4 Chaos Gods fighting one another, as seen in the 8th edition Chaos Demons Codex, which describes it as one of the greatest manifestations of the Great Game ever to spill into reality. The titanic engagements between the Chaos Gods' legions take place across 100 fronts, but one single battle stands above all others, for none can match the sheer scale of slaughter that occurs upon the planet of Vigrid. Armies clash, and powers of such magnitude are released that the planet, now reshaped into a demon world, is shattered. The debris shifting into the warp, where the surviving combatants continue their battle as they float upon the formless seas of the Immaterium. It is a maelstrom of conflict unending, with each side sending in a constant stream of new legions. This destructive war would continue like this until Tzeentch eventually proposed settling the war through a contest of champions.
Oh, scary! Oh, shiver my timbers! Shut up, man!
Confident in their own representatives, the other Chaos Gods agreed. Now, unlike Tzeentch, who selected the galaxy's greatest professional scam artist, Karos Fateweaver, Nurgle's chosen champion, who is not named in the Codex unfortunately, actually does pretty well. In fact, Nurgle's champion was actively defeating Slaaneash's champion, overcoming their seductive tricks and temptations of the Dark Prince's servant through sheer durability and rot. But then, Karos Fateweaver did exactly what you'd expect from a servant of the Schemer God. As even when Khorne's champion appeared to be dominating the contest, the Fateweaver somehow still emerged victorious through trickery, manipulation, or whatever incomprehensible 8D chess move he had prepared beforehand. The Codex never actually explains how he won, which really does make it even more suspicious. The result was immediate chaos. Khorne became so enraged by the outcome that his roar shattered every illusion on the battlefield, blasted apart the surrounding war zone, and sent shockwaves through reality. Yet despite all of this destruction, nothing was ever really settled. And so, just as it always has and always will, the Great Game continued. Now these aren't the only times Nurgle has fought the other Chaos Gods. As for example, in that same codex, Nurgle has also fought Slaaneash. And yes, he was able to defeat her.
Victory!
During the eternal wranglings and wars that make up the Great Game, it came about that Tzeentch tricked Slaaneash into an unwinnable battle against both Khorne and Nurgle. The ill-fated Provocation Wars. It was a hard-fought series of campaigns that ended only with the Dark Prince's utter defeat and subsequent humiliation. So Slaaneash was defeated, and even the text says she was humiliated, implying that it wasn't a great look for the Prince of Pleasure. but it does appear that Nurgle and Khorne may have tag teamed her. So it makes it a better look for Slaanesh and more of a worse feat for Nurgle. But it's better than nothing, right guys? Oh well. Outside of fighting the other Chaos Gods, Nurgle has also repeatedly inflicted catastrophic damages upon the material universe. We see this with events such as the Deluge of Sickness, which claimed 8 entire star systems, as endless, diseased rain transformed worlds into plague-ridden wastelands before dragging them into the warp. We also have the living plagues of Thruskis Sign, which devastated a world that had supposedly eradicated all natural illness, which of course Nurgle didn't like, as well as Nurgle's conquest of the Scourge Stars before the war in the Rift. And to be quite frank, this is probably happening constantly throughout the Imperium. The galaxy contains millions of worlds, countless billions of souls, and more disease outbreaks than I can count on my go fingers. These are simply the examples important enough to make it into the codexes. And unlike Khorne, who announces his arrival with chain axes and planetary massacres, Nurgle often destroys civilizations and empires through a slow and rotting process. So keep that in mind, that although these are the feats we have on paper, Nurgle has probably killed billions of souls across the galaxy through a spread of rot and diseases. We just don't have them recorded in any of the canon codexes or books. So overall, Nurgle's abilities are exactly what you'd expect from the God of Decay. He can manipulate the warp, spread supernatural diseases, corrupt minds and souls, influence fate through the skein, create an endless army of demons from fragments of his own essence, and draw power from despair, mortality, disease, and stagnation across reality. As for his feats, to summarize, Nurgle has consumed entire star systems with his plagues, fought in the Great Game against the other Chaos Gods, conquered vast regions of the Warp, launched galaxy-shaking invasions like the Plague Wars, and remains powerful enough to remain a challenge to the other Chaos Gods. But now comes the real fun part, fellas. Where exactly does all of this place the Plague Father within the wider scale of Warhammer 40k? Well, let's find out. Before we talk about where Nurgle scales specifically, we need to lay out the almighty, disease-ridden, probably infested with 3 new plagues by the time you finish reading this, best part of my videos. A cow's power pyramid. And we've got the same tiers as always, people. At the bottom, we've got the Chapter Master tier, where you'll find your standard Orc War Bosses, Eldar Exarchs, and Space Marine Chapter Masters. Above that is the Enhanced tier. Here you'll find your standard Adeptus Custodes, the gene-enhanced warriors of the Emperor. After them is the Swarm Lord, the supposed pinnacle of the Hive Mind, but in reality an absolute bum. And finally, Lilith Hesperax, and the greatest mortal warriors of the galaxy like her, who I view as the true gatekeepers of the top of the Enhanced tier. Next comes the Primarch tiers. And I do need to clarify something first, because some people got confused, and I think I'm just going to keep reiterating it for the rest of this series. When I say base Primarch, I'm talking about the Primarchs at their standard Great Crusade era peak, unamped, unaltered, and operating at their normal baseline. So the low Primarch tier includes beings like the mightiest greater demons, such as Skarbrand, Angrath the Unbound, or Kugath Plaguefather. Then we also have the Avatar of Cain and the weaker base Primarchs, like Lorgar, Alfarius, Omegon, and Guilliman. After that comes the high Primarch tier, where the real monsters really start to show up. Here we find the greatest base Primarchs, like Sanguinius, the Lion, Horus, Leman Russ, Conrad Kurz, Angron, and Fulgrim. After that, we reach the planetary tier, which includes Transcendent Catan Shards and the Demon Primarchs. These are beings who can threaten or destroy entire worlds. Above that is the Cosmic tier, where I place entities like the Silent King or the Emperor in 30k. And finally, at the very top of the 40k universe, we reach the Multiversal tier. Here you'll find God Emperor Horus, the Emperor seated upon the Golden Throne, and the fully formed Catan, These are entities whose influence and power stretches across realities, timelines, possibility, fate, and the very structure of existence. And with all of that established, it's finally time to see where Grandfather Nurgle, the Lord of Decay, the master of pestilence, and the galaxy's most horrifyingly affectionate green Chud, truly sits on my pyramid. Well, at this point, I'm pretty much doing the same exact thing I did for Khorne, Tzeentch, and Slaanesh, so I'll just come out and say it. Just like with the other three degenerates, we're dealing with the exact same being here. Nurgle has clear reality manipulation, warp control, conceptual influence, and authority over his own realm within the warp. On top of that, he exists across multiple realities and draws power from countless mortal minds all at once. So, by the very definition, he immediately sits within the multiversal tier. And as a result, he easily scales above everything in the Chapter Master, Enhanced, Primarch, Planetary, and Cosmic tiers. But the real discussion starts after that, because we need to find out where exactly in the multiversal tier he sits. Because here we're dealing with the Thronebound Emperor, God Emperor Horus, the other Chaos Gods, and the full-blown Catan. Starting, of course, with everyone's favorite bald menace, God Emperor Horus. And even at his absolute peak, Horus is essentially still a demigod, being crammed with a ton of power. Sure, he can warp reality, manipulate time and space, and even the skein, but he's still ultimately drawing power from forces far greater than himself. Nurgle, though, isn't borrowing power from anyone. He is literally decay, despair, and rot made manifest. Horus may wield fragments of chaos, but Nurgle is one of those entities those fragments originate from. It's the difference between holding a cup of ocean water and being the ocean. So if we're talking about a direct comparison in terms of raw metaphysical power, Nurgle comfortably sits above God Emperor Horus. And next we come to the Emperor on the Golden Toilet. And here's where Nurgle sadly stops. Because as I just discussed earlier, the Emperor was able to burn a portion of the Garden of Nurgle, as seen in the book Godblight. And Nurgle apparently couldn't do anything to stop him, which is why he hits a wall in terms of scaling. The Garden of Nurgle is supposed to be his domain. It is the literal manifestation of his will and power within the warp, shaped by his own will and essence. Meaning in theory, this is where he should be at his absolute strongest. Yet, the Emperor's presence through Guilliman as a conduit doesn't just resist it, he just walks in there and burns it completely to shreds. And to make matters even worse for the stinky boy, in the 5th edition rulebook, it's implied that the Emperor's psychic power is spread throughout the galaxy, and is not one concrete form. His immense psychic powers envelop and protect mankind across the galaxy. His consciousness wanders through warp space, warring against demons that inhabit it, keeping closed the doors between this world and the next. So what we're dealing with here is not exactly a one-on-one. The Emperor we see is potentially only a fragment of a far larger psychic presence, one that is simultaneously active across the entire galaxy, time, and space, engaged in constant conflict with the other Chaos Gods and their minions. And even when he does manifest more directly, as seen in his interaction with Guilliman, it is implied that he has essentially gathered together multiple fragments of himself to assemble himself into a coherent form, just to communicate, let alone act. So just to really summarize what happened here, the Emperor possessed Guilliman, and to be fair, we don't know how much of the Emperor we're dealing with here, revived him entirely from the godblight disease, and then proceeded to walk right into Nurgle's domain and burn it to shreds. And Nurgle did nothing to stop it at all. Now, this could be interpreted as Nurgle being an absolute bum, and being vastly inferior to the Emperor's power. But we do have one statement from Godblight that does make them almost comparable, or at least almost relative to each other in raw strength. Away in the distance, ever visible whenever you went in the garden, Nurgle's black mance shivered, and Mortarion felt another presence as powerful as the first, looking at him from behind its ever-shuttered windows. This, at the very minimum, implies that Nurgle and the God Emperor on the Golden Throne must be at least similar to each other in their power. As the text states, as powerful as the first, which is speaking about the Emperor. so they've gotta at least be close in raw strength and power, leaving us in a situation where Nurgle is unquestionably one of the most powerful entities in the setting, but not invulnerable even within his own domain, when confronted by another sufficiently powerful entity. So pretty much I'm going to place Nurgle right behind the God Emperor on the Golden Throne, but not too far behind since they should be almost comparable in strength, but the Emperor clearly has the advantage. In regards to the other Chaos Gods, and since I don't want to spoil the full rankings which are coming out very soon, I'll keep things as simple as always. Nurgle sits in that same top bracket as the other Chaos Gods, operating on a multiversal level of reality-shaping influence. And that's all I'm gonna say. No spoilers. Also, in regards to the Catan, like I've talked about many times, they were once the peak of the material universe. Beings of pure physical law given form, able to manipulate time, space, causality, and even erase existence. But once again, this comparison just breaks down because these entities, the Chaos Gods and the Catan, don't operate on the same layer of existence. The Catan are the masters of the Materium, while Nurgle is the embodiment of decay, disease, and rot within the warp. One is structure and the other is decay given form. So, in the current setting, with the Catan shattered and the Chaos Gods fully active and empowered, Nurgle, like the rest of the Chaos Pantheon, comfortably sits at the top of the multiversal tier, just behind the God Emperor on the Golden Throne, but definitely over God Emperor Horus during the end and the death. And that is going to do it for today's video. Soon I will finally rank all of them from weakest to strongest based on their current strength in the current setting. So drop your predictions down in the comments, folks. I also plan on talking about every single time a Chaos God was ascendant in the Great Game. So that includes talking about Prime Tzeentch, a period of time when Nurgle actually reigned supreme, and of course Slaanesh at her birth, just to make things as interesting and as thorough as possible. So make sure you stay tuned for that one, fellas. It's gonna be coming out real soon. I also have plans to continue my agenda pushing with Leman Russ next. I know, what the hell, a Fallen Cow is actually going to push a Leman Russ agenda? What has the world come to? But yes, I'm going to do that, so stay tuned for that as well. I also plan on finally pushing out grading every single Primarch's decision during the Horus Heresy, the sequel to the very successful grading every single Space Marine Legion. So once again, stay tuned for that one. Also, a massive shout out to my Patreon and YouTube members. Keydree, Tellerpick7, Girthquake72, Impossy Paul, Immorally Bankrupt, 1461, Ritter S, Musty, Seth Capizilla, Lag, Cunning Karkle, Caleb White, Dinkleberry, Anish, Chatterjee, Jack Roar, and Michael Skipper 7277. But yeah, that's gonna do it for my Chaos God series. I've scaled Khorne, Slaanesh, Tzeentch, and the Chud himself, Nurgle now. And I'm probably going to tackle the Emperor in the next 2 months, maybe 3 months, and it's going to be a very long video. I've seen other creators do him, and don't get me wrong, they've done splendid jobs on him. But I think I could do an even more in-depth, and even more autistic take on our favorite golden boy. Yes, I'm going to probably scale every single variation and form of him across 40k, which includes him pre-Moloch, post-Moloch, during his battle against Horus in the Warp Bubble in the End of the Death Part 2 and 3, his form on the Golden Throne, and of course, the Dark King. So it's probably going to be damn near a 3-hour long video, but I am very excited to finally tackle that. As always, my beautiful, amazing herd, you guys mean the absolute world to me. Thank you for sticking through this entire mini-series, and as always, stay milked. I'll see you all real soon.